This is Tim Staten with Tim Stating the Obvious. What is this podcast about? It's simple. You are entitled to great leadership everywhere you go, whether it's to church, whether it's to work, whether it's at your house, you are entitled to great leadership. And so in this podcast, we take leadership principles and theories and turn them into everyday, relatable, and usable advice.
And a quick disclaimer, this show, process, or service by trademark manufacturer, otherwise does not necessarily constitute an implied endorsement of anyone that I employed by or favors them in representation. The views are expressed here in my show are my own expressed and do not necessarily state or reflect those of any employer.
Hey, and welcome back to another episode. In our last episode, we talked about how to practice ethical fitness, and in this episode, we're going to be asking questions and about the importance of asking questions, right? I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, what in the world could you possibly say about asking questions? Well, in my experience, we as professionals always go to events or meetings, and there's some type of keynote speaker or there's some type of panel, and then there are senior leaders who always say, well, what questions do you have? And then, there's this awkward silence between who should ask the first question and what should the question be. And it's really what should I ask, right? So if it's a panel discussion, those questions are easy, and you know what questions to ask. But if you're in a meeting with somebody who you've never met before, and then they're obviously on the executive level, and they ask questions, and they say, okay, well, what questions do you have for me? They want someone in the room to ask the question, and more often than not, they want like 3 to 5 questions, right? Because they're like, their mindset is I'm taking my time to come down here and talk to you. You obviously have questions because you're not where I am. So you should be asking me questions, which in theory sounds great. But ever since I was a junior leader, I was always been kind of deterred from asking questions. More so, when it came to like job stuff, right? So I remember I had this one boss, and he's a great guy, and I would always say, hey, I have this question. I'd ask him the question, and he would say, you know what? At one point, it's like, you know what? Don't ask me any stupid questions. And I told him, I said, well, there's no such thing as a stupid question. The only stupid question is the one that goes unanswered or unasked. And he goes, no. What a stupid question is anything that I know the answer to that you don't. So go figure it out before you think you have to ask me. And I can understand that to a point, right? So you want people to research and you want people to kind of come to a conclusion before you ask them questions. And then, fast forward several years later, I found out that if you asked a question in a panel event or an open forum, that question that you had about something would often turn into a tasking that got sent back to you to resolve. So then the message was okay, well, don't ask a question that somebody who is more senior than me knows the answer to that I don't. And then also, if you ask a question, it's a good question, but it's also important, it's going to come back to you to get fixed anyway. So do you really want to get more work? So that was kind of like discouragement number 2. Then I was, a little bit more senior, and I had a senior leader say, hey, it was like, I think it's really important that everybody ask questions. No matter who you are, no matter what your seniority is, everybody needs to ask questions, and it's extremely important that you do. And I thought to myself, okay, great. That sounds good. And he goes, and there's 2 reasons for that. He goes, because if you don't ask the question, you'll never get the answer to. Okay, well, that makes sense. We all need to have shared understanding, and we all need to understand the questions and the answers to things, so I get that. And he goes, and it also shows me what you should know that you don't know, and, where you need some development in. And he goes, and if you're a little bit more senior, it just helps me highlight what you don't know. And then I thought to myself, well, if anybody picked up on this that's more senior, is he's really saying, I want you to ask me questions, but I'm going to also be judging you while you ask the questions on the level of competency that you have based on your experience level. Which I thought, well, that was kind of strange. I know I'm not the only one that has had this experience where people feel like if I ask a question, and if I legitimately don't know the answer to it and I ask the question, there may be other people in the room who may know the answer, and then they start thinking, oh, well, this guy is clearly not as smart or as brilliant as I am because I know the answer to this question and he doesn't. And now this person is highlighting how incompetent they are or how unintelligent they are by asking these questions. And this leader just really re-emphasized that point. But he also said it's really important, though, that you ask that question so that way you do know for the future. And he said if you're a junior, make sure you ask all the questions that you can so that way when you become more senior, you won't have to ask the embarrassing questions about something that you should know that you don't know. And I thought that was great advice for like someone who's just entering into an organization, to not discourage them from asking questions, to like ask legitimate hard questions, ask legitimate thinking questions, and so that they can learn and understand. But if you're more senior, though, you got to be more reserved in the questions that you're asking, because if you ask the wrong question, you're just highlighting how stupid you are, according to this person. And so there were a lot of my peers who felt like that they didn't want to ask any questions because they're like, well, I'm just going to highlight what I don't know, and then I'm going to be judged on that, and that could hurt my evaluation or my rating period at the end of the year. And then I started going around to different places and seeing differing events, and I noticed sort of the same things. People say, yes, ask me questions, but they're really, that's how they're going to poll and judge the people that they're with on the level of questions that they ask. And usually the questions that are asked are ones that really challenge the person who's in the senior leader position to take away and look at something that they can't control, right? Something that's beyond their control, or something they need to push up to a higher level to get resolved. And anything that's a question that's asked at their level, it just gets sent back down to you to action. So I was thinking about this for a while, and I was like, well, how could we help people get better at asking questions? And then how can we help people feel more confident and comfortable in asking questions publicly without the fear of being judged? And I thought about it for a while. And then I was looking at all the different events that I went to, and I came up with 3 things that we could do. So 1, you can demonstrate as a leader how to ask questions without feeling inferior. And 2, how you can show how to ask questions that prompt a good response, or don't get a tasking back at you, right? So the first method is that I would recommend is that you ask questions for people who are afraid to ask the question. So you're asking clarifying questions to re-emphasize a point or to make something more clear. I don't know, I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting where I've had myself and my team and some other folks on different teams in the room, and the senior leader's talking and talking and talking. Everyone's doing the head nod. Yep, got it. But then you look around and you see people who just aren't getting it. And that's okay, because everyone has different levels of experience. And so they're not getting it. And so that means they're not understanding it. And so message sent is not message received. And so I would make notes based off of what I thought people were not understanding. And then when it came time for questions, and I would say, well, hey, I have a question. Can you please clarify what you meant about X, Y, and Z? And what does that look like? Could you please explain this topic in a little bit more detail so that everybody can understand and help me get a better understanding and clarification of what you're talking about? So then as he's explaining it and talking about it, I would look around the room again and I would see people who are getting it and writing it down, right? So that's a good way to ask questions on the behalf of other people, right? And sometimes you can tell people on your team, like, hey, if you have a question, if you don't want to ask it, pass me a note in the meeting and I'll ask the question at the end. And I've done that several times. And at the end, I've actually had a senior leader come up to me and he was like, hey, I know that you asked these questions. I thought you would know the answer to them. And I said, well, I did, but the questions weren't for me. They were for other people and they didn't want to be judged. So they asked me to ask their question. So I did. And obviously you had a judgment call because you called me over. We're talking about it after the meeting, but you cared enough to ask. You cared enough to ask and follow up with me like, hey, why are you asking those questions? It doesn't really seem like. And I said, and I appreciate you doing that, because if you didn't care, you would just roll on and walk away with your own judgment like, oh, you don't matter. And I said, because people feel judged when they ask questions. So for them not to feel judged, I'll ask the question. And then I think that kind of stuck with that person for a little bit, because every other subsequent meeting after that, they didn't caveat anything other than, hey, if you don't understand something and you legitimately don't understand it, please ask the question. And he would say, no one will judge you and I am not judging you. And he had to backtrack on his previous statements that he made before, because when he really wanted people to ask questions, he was still judging them. And it wasn't until we brought it up to his attention, or her attention, that it was fixed. So tip number one, if you're going to ask questions and you kind of feel afraid to ask them for people who are afraid to ask, and then ask clarifying questions to get something that was already stated to make it a little bit more clear. And then another technique I like to do is I like to ask people, what questions do you want to get asked, but you never get asked? Oftentimes, if you're talking to a high-level leader or a keynote speaker, they're talking, right? And they're always, giving back, because the reason why they ask for questions is because they have all of this knowledge that they want to impart upon you. But they don't know what's really important to you until you ask this question. But sometimes they feel like there is something really burning that they need to share, but they never really get asked the question. And they also don't ever really shape what they're sharing on their speak or their brief or the presentation to really prompt that question either. So oftentimes I'll ask that question towards the end. Of course, I won't ask that at the beginning, but I'll ask it towards the end. I'll say, well, what is the one thing, or what are the questions that you wish you got asked that you never get asked? And then my follow-up question to that, which would be a third technique, is I would ask them, is there anything that we should have asked, but we didn't ask you and we need to know, right? So those are two different things, but kind of similar, right? So the second technique is all about, what do you want to get off your chest and what do you have a burning desire to share? And the last one is, what should we have asked you, but we didn't ask you? So after we've talked and we've asked you all these questions, what is going in the back of your mind that goes, these people, they didn't ask this question. I think I would have asked this question. And instead of just saying, hey, you didn't ask this question, so I'm going to go ahead and tell it to you, oftentimes people will just get to the last question. There'll be an awkward moment of silence followed by the extra awkward moment of silence to really make sure nobody else has a question, and they'll move on. And then they'll never share that thing that was in the back of their mind that they're like, man, they should have really asked this question. Well, one, to the people in that position, if you really think they should have asked that question, you should have offered it up. But two, that's why people like me exist, right? So we can ask that question and say, hey, what didn't we ask that we should have asked, but we need to know? And I usually ask that on a lot of things, especially if I'm running a meeting or if I'm running a presentation and people are asking me questions. I will usually ask that of other people too, is what didn't I ask you that I should have? So that way I can get a better clarifying, representation of what's going on in their thought processes. So this is a little quick, easy, fun episode about asking questions. And, it can become, a huge stressor for some people when it comes to meetings, or it comes to events or briefings or speaking or conferences. And then it gets to the question time and they're like, oh man, some people feel like they're pressured to ask a question. And some people feel like, oh, if I don't ask a question, people are going to think less of me. Should I ask the right question? What if I ask the wrong question? Well, my recommendation to you is do three things. One, ask clarifying questions. Ask questions that really help bring home the point of what they're trying to make, if they haven't already done so. Two, ask them, hey, is there anything that, you wanted to get asked, but you never get asked? And then three, ask them, what should we have asked you that we didn't and we need to know? Those three things, if you want to get a really good response out of somebody, those three questions will be really good for responses. So how do you handle these situations when it comes to asking questions? I know I can't be the only one out there when it comes to asking questions and answering questions, or when it comes to question time. There may be a little bit of angst out there on that. So how do you handle that? What techniques would you offer up to other people? I look forward to hearing from you on that, just to see One, how you actually handle it, and what do you think about those situations? So I want to thank you for stopping by and listening to this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it. Before we go, I'd like to ask a favor of you if I could. If you could please share this episode with 1 or 2 people who you think would like this topic. If you haven't followed or subscribed on this platform that you're listening to, please go ahead and hit those little icons. And then also the alert icon, so that way you know when we post another episode. If you got some value out of this episode, please leave a review or comment so that we can help spread the word, and other people who may not have found this podcast yet will eventually find it, because it might be something they're interested in. So I want to thank you again for stopping by. I'm Tim Staten, stating the obvious.